Picture this. The Cathani were living their absolute best life across 3 star systems. We're talking about a civilization that had cracked the code of perfection. Their crystal cities weren't just buildings. They were living artworks that grew from the ground up, each tower singing in harmony with the others. Imagine walking through streets made of pure light, where every step you took created music that blended with the symphony of an entire world. These beings had figured out something most species never do: true peace. For over 10,000 years, they'd never fought a single war. Not one. Their technology was so advanced it looked like magic to everyone else. They could heal any wound with a touch, travel between worlds in the blink of an eye, and their greatest achievement? They literally sang to each other across the void of space. Not radio signals or digital messages. Actual songs that carried emotion, memory, and meaning across light years. The Cathani had 3 worlds, each more beautiful than the last. The first was covered in floating gardens that drifted through crystal-clear skies. The second had oceans of liquid light, where their young learned to swim through pure energy. The third was their crown jewel, a planet where every mountain was a living cathedral that resonated with the voices of their ancestors. For generations, other species looked at the Cathani with a mixture of admiration and jealousy. Here was proof that a civilization could evolve beyond violence, beyond the brutal struggle for survival that marked most of galactic history. They were teachers, healers, artists. Their greatest weapons were instruments that created beauty instead of destruction. Then the Scourge showed up, and everything went straight to hell. Now, when I say Scourge, I need you to understand we're not talking about your typical alien invasion. These things are biomechanical nightmares that make your worst sci-fi horror movie look like a children's cartoon. Picture creatures that are part machine, part organic tissue, and all hunger. They don't just kill you. They consume everything you are and turn it into more themselves. The Scourge have been eating their way across the galaxy for decades, but they'd always hit the tough guys first: warrior races, military empires, species that knew how to fight. The Cathani thought they were safe because they were so far from the conflict zones. They were wrong. When the Scourge fleet emerged from hyperspace above the first Cathani world, it wasn't even close to a fair fight. The Cathani had maybe a dozen ships designed for exploration and trade. The Scourge brought thousands of vessels that looked like someone had crossed a battleship of a virus and taught it to hate everything beautiful in the universe. The first world fell in 6 hours. Those floating gardens? Consumed and converted into Scourge breeding grounds. The second world lasted maybe 8 hours, long enough for desperate evacuation ships to flee toward the home planet. The liquid light oceans turned black as the Scourge fed on the pure energy, growing stronger with every passing minute. By the time the survivors reached their home world, they knew they were looking at the end of everything their species had ever built. The Cathani fleet, those beautiful ships designed for peace and exploration, tried to make a stand. They had maybe 30 vessels against a swarm that numbered in the thousands. It was like watching butterflies try to fight hurricanes. High Priestess Zartich watched from the planet's surface as her people's ships died one by one in the darkness above. Each explosion was another family, another group of scholars or artists or healers who would never create beauty again. The Scourge didn't just kill, they erased. Every ship they destroyed became raw material for more of their twisted vessels. As the last of Cathani defense fleet winked out like dying stars, Zartich found herself doing something her people had never done in their entire history. She knelt before their most powerful communication array, a device designed to carry their songs of joy across the galaxy, and she begged. This was a species that had never known defeat, never experienced true desperation, never had to plead for their lives. But here she was, broadcasting a message of pure terror and hope across every frequency they could reach. She wasn't being proud or diplomatic. She was crying out to anyone, anywhere in the galaxy who might have the strength to face what was coming. The message was simple. We are dying. Our children are dying. Please, if there's anyone out there who can fight these monsters, we need you now. We have nothing left to offer except our gratitude and the promise that we will remember your names forever if you can save what remains of our people. The response came from the absolute last place anyone expected. A tiny backwater solar system that most of the galactic community had written off decades ago. The locals called it the Sol System, and it contained a little blue-green death world called Earth, populated by creatures so violent and unpredictable that the Galactic Council had placed the entire system under permanent quarantine. The Cathani were about to discover why. When the human fleet drops out of hyperspace above the dying Cathani world, you could practically hear the collective gasp from every survivor watching their sensors. The Cathani had been expecting maybe another sleek diplomatic vessel, or perhaps some advanced warship with flowing lines and elegant weapon systems. What they got instead looked like someone had taken a scrapyard, welded guns at everything that could float, and somehow convinced it to fly through space. These weren't ships in any traditional sense. They were floating fortresses built from whatever humanity could get their hands on. Old mining barges with missile pods strapped to their sides. Cargo haulers that had been gutted and turned into weapon platforms. Even a few luxury cruise liners that some crazy humans had converted into makeshift battleships, complete with casino signs still flickering on the hull. The biggest ship in the fleet, if you could call it that, looked like 3 different vessels had crashed into each other and decided to just keep going. It was the UNS Defiance, and it was flying a battle flag that simply read, "Earth sends its regards." The Cathani didn't know whether to laugh or cry at the sight of their supposed saviors. Commander Mike Thompson stood on the bridge of the Defiance, studying the tactical displays with a kind of calm that only comes from years of dealing with situations that should be impossible to survive. At 45, Mike had been through 3 alien incursions, 2 asteroid mining wars, and the infamous Martian Rebellion, where humans had to fight in an atmosphere that was literally trying to kill them every second. The data streaming in from Cathani's sensors should have sent any reasonable military commander running for the nearest exit. The Scourge weren't just dangerous. They were adapted to perfection. Every battle report showed the same terrifying pattern. First contact would go okay, maybe even give the defender some hope. Then the Scourge would analyze the weapons being used against them, and within hours, sometimes minutes, they would evolve countermeasures. Plasma weapons that had worked in the first wave would be completely useless by the second. Energy shields that protected entire fleets would be drained dry by the third encounter. The Scourge learned, adapted, and overcame everything thrown at them with the efficiency of a biological computer program for war. Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez, Mike's second in command, was reading through the tactical assessments with a frown that kept getting deeper. "Sir, according to these reports, no conventional weapon has worked against them for more than a few engagements. Every species that's fought them has tried the same approach. Better tech, bigger guns, stronger shields. And every single one of them lost." Mike nodded, but there wasn't even a hint of concern in his expression. "That's because they're thinking like civilized species," Rodriguez. "They're trying to win a clean war. The thing is, humans have been fighting impossible odds since the day their ancestors first picked up rocks and decided to take on saber-toothed tigers. While other species evolved in relatively safe environments, developing technology and culture in peace, humans came from a world that spent millions of years actively trying to murder them. Earth wasn't just dangerous. It was creatively dangerous. Hurricanes that could level entire cities. Earthquakes that rearranged continents. Volcanoes that blocked out the sun for years. And that was just the planet itself. Then you had the wildlife. Everything from microscopic viruses that could wipe out entire populations to massive predators that saw early humans as convenient snack food. Most species that faced these kind of challenges went extinct. Humans looked at a planet full of things trying to kill them and said, "Challenge accepted." They didn't just survive, they thrived. They learned to hunt creatures 10 times their size, build shelters that could withstand natural disasters, and turn every environmental threat into a tool they could use. By the time humans reached space, they'd already spent thousands of generations learning the most important lesson in the universe. When the rules say you can't win, you change the rules. Mike pulled up the fleet roster on his screen. 57 ships of various sizes and descriptions, crewed by about 12,000 of the craziest, most stubborn humans Earth could spare. They had miners who'd spent decades working in asteroid belts where one small mistake meant death. Military veterans who'd fought in 3-dimensional battlefields where up and down were meaningless concepts. Engineers who could jury-rig life support systems from spare parts and prayer. The Scourge had faced warrior races, advanced civilizations, and ancient empires. They'd adapted to every form of conventional warfare the galaxy could throw at them. But they'd never faced a species that treated survival as a creative art form, where every impossible situation was just another puzzle to solve with whatever tools happened to be lying around. Rodriguez, Mike said, settling into his command chair with a kind of smile that usually meant someone was about to have a very bad day. Send a message to Cathani. Tell them to sit back and watch how Deathworlders handle pest control. The Cathani were about to learn why the Galactic Council had quarantined Earth in the first place. The first battle started exactly how every galactic military academy said it shouldn't. No formal declarations, no organized formations, no careful analysis of enemy capabilities. Commander Mike Thompson took one look at the massive scourge swarm approaching the Cathani homeworld and basically said, "All right, folks, let's see what happens when we throw everything at them and pray something sticks." The scourge had been expecting another conventional assault. Every species they'd encountered followed the same predictable pattern. Form up in neat battle lines. Fire your best weapons. Retreat when those weapons stopped working. Then repeat until you ran out of ships or ammunition. It was logical, efficient, and completely useless against an enemy that adapted to everything you threw at them. What they got instead was pure chaos. The human fleet didn't form battle lines. They didn't even pretend to have a unified strategy. Instead, 57 ships scattered in every direction like a flock of angry hornets, each captain apparently making up their own personal war plan on the spot. The Cathani military observers watching from the surface were frantically trying to understand what they were seeing, but human tactics don't translate well to species that actually plan things out. The UES Hammer, a converted mining ship captained by a former asteroid prospector named Jack Wilson, opened fire with standard plasma cannons. For about 15 minutes. It worked great. Scourge vessels were exploding left and right, their dark holes cracking under the superheated energy blasts. Then, just like every other battle report had predicted, the Scourge adapted. Their hull plating shifted, developed some kind of energy-dispersing coating, and suddenly plasma fire was about as effective as throwing rocks. Any sane military would have retreated to analyze the situation and develop new strategies. Jack Wilson switched to kinetic rounds, basically very expensive bullets fired at a significant fraction of light speed. When the Cathani military advisors asked why, his response was recorded for posterity. Because sometimes the old ways work best, and bullets don't care how fancy your armor is. For another 20 minutes, humanity's oldest weapon technology was tearing through scourge vessels like tissue paper. The enemy was frankly trying to adapt their hulls to deflect kinetic impact, reinforcing their armor, adjusting their internal structures. Just as they figure out how to handle high-velocity projectiles, Captain Lisa Murphy on the UES Stubborn switched tactics again. Chemical explosives, not the sophisticated antimatter warheads or quantum torpedoes that other species used. We're talking about good old-fashioned bombs that worked on the same principle humans had been using since they figured out how to mix the right powders together. The Scourge had been adapting to energy weapons and kinetic projectiles. They had no idea what to do with devices that simply made very large portions of space suddenly expand in all directions very quickly. The Cathani observers were losing their minds trying to track what was happening. Human ships were switching weapon systems mid-battle, sometimes mid-engagement. One ship would fire plasma until it stopped working, switch to bullets until those stopped working, then launch chemical warheads until the Scourge figured those out too. By the time the enemy had adapted to one approach, the humans had already moved on to something completely different. But the moment that really broke everyone's understanding of warfare came when Lieutenant Tom Bradley found himself facing a Scourge heavy cruiser that had adapted to every weapon in his arsenal. His ship, the UES Never Surrender, was a converted cargo hauler that had been pressed into military service with about as much armor as a tin can and half the weapons it needed. Any rational captain would have retreated. Tom Bradley looked at the tactical display, looked at his crew, and made an announcement that would have gotten him court-martialed in any other military. Well, folks, when bullets don't work and bombs don't work, there's always the ship itself. What happened next was the first recorded case of a human captain deliberately ramming an enemy vessel, not out of desperation, but as a calculated tactical decision. Tom had his crew evacuate to escape pods, set the ship's autopilot on a collision course, and ejected at the last possible second. the Never Surrender, all 15,000 tons of converted cargo hauler, slammed into the Scourge cruiser at a significant fraction of light speed and turned both vessels into an expanding cloud of very expensive debris. The Cathani military command was speechless. These humans had just used a billion-credit spacecraft as a missile, not because they were desperate or out of options, but because it seemed like the most practical solution to their immediate problem. What the galaxy didn't understand was that this was completely normal human behavior. On Earth, everything was expendable if it meant survival. Early humans had learned to use rocks until they broke, then found sharper rocks. They built shelters that got destroyed by storms, then built better shelters. They domesticated animals that sometimes ate them, invented tools that sometimes exploded, and explored territories that killed most of the people who tried. Humans didn't fight to preserve their technology or maintain some elegant military doctrine. They fought like every battle might be their last, using whatever worked until it didn't work, then immediately switching to something else. They treated their ships the same way their ancestors treated spears and arrows, as tools that existed to solve problems, even if solving the problem meant breaking the tool. Captain Rodriguez, watching the battle from the command ship, summed it up perfectly when she radioed the Cathani observers. You wanted warriors who could beat an adaptive enemy? We're a species that spent 1,000,000 years adapting to a planet that was actively trying to kill us. This isn't warfare, this is pest control. The Scourge were about to learn why being adaptive wasn't enough when your enemy was more adaptive than you were. As the war spread across multiple star systems, something unprecedented started happening. The Scourge, who had spent decades consuming entire civilizations, suddenly found themselves dealing with an enemy that seemed to invent new ways to fight faster than they could adapt to them. What started as a conventional space battle was quickly turning into something that would make every military strategist in the galaxy rewrite their textbooks, assuming they survived to tell the story. Captain Lisa Parker was commanding a small flotilla near the Proxima system when her science officer, Dr. Kevin Walsh, came up with an idea that was either brilliant or completely insane. Looking at a star that was already unstable from recent solar flares, Kevin suggested they could use their mining equipment to destabilize it further. Not to mine it, to turn it into the biggest bomb in the system. Most species would have spent months studying the feasibility, running computer simulations, getting approval from a dozen different committees. Lisa looked at the massive Scourge fleet heading their way and said, "How long do you need?" The answer was 6 hours. What they did next violated so many interstellar treaties that the Galactic Council would later create an entirely new category of warfare just to properly condemn it. Using modified mining lasers and carefully placed charges, they triggered a controlled stellar collapse. Not enough to create a supernova. They weren't trying to destroy half the galaxy. Just enough to turn a stable star into an expanding wave of superheated plasma that covered an area roughly the size of 3 solar systems. The Scourge fleet that had been adapting to human weapons suddenly found themselves trying to adapt to the raw fury of a dying star. You can't evolve fast enough to survive temperatures that exist at the core of suns. Entire sectors of the Scourge Armada just stopped existing, converted instantly into component atoms scattered across light years of space. But that was just the beginning. Captain Ryan Foster, commanding a deep space reconnaissance ship called the UES Lucky Break, was dealing with a different problem. His sector had been overrun by Scourge vessels, and they'd learned to counter every conventional weapon his small task force could deploy. Ryan was a former physicist who joined the military after the Mars conflicts, and he was looking at the tactical display when he noticed something interesting. There was a small black hole about 2 light years away, a leftover from some ancient stellar collision that created a gravitational anomaly most ships just navigate around. Ryan looked at it, looked at the Scourge fleet, and asked his engineering team a question that would have gotten him committed to a psychiatric facility in peacetime. "Can we move that thing?" The answer, apparently, was yes. Using their jump drives in ways that probably violated several laws of physics, Ryan's team managed to create a series of micro-jumps that gradually shifted the black hole's position. It took 3 days of constant work, with half his crew taking stimulants to stay awake, but they managed to relocate a stellar mass black hole directly into the path of the incoming Scourge fleet. The results were immediate and spectacular. Scourge vessels that had been adapting to energy weapons and kinetic projectiles suddenly found themselves dealing with gravity distortions that were literally tearing space-time apart. Ships that got too close were stretched into spaghetti-like strands of matter before disappearing beyond the event horizon. Those that tried to retreat found their escape routes blocked by gravitational fields that bent light itself. But the moment that really showcased human creativity came from the younger pilots. The ones who'd grown up playing video games where dying just meant respawning and trying again. Lieutenant Amy Chun was leading a squadron of fast attack craft when they encountered a Scourge formation that had adapted to every weapon in their arsenal. These weren't the massive capital ships that could be handled with stellar engineering. These were smaller, faster vessels that required precision targeting. Amy looked at her fuel gauges, looked at her remaining ammunition, and came up with a solution that would have terrified anyone with a basic understanding of jump drive technology. She convinced her squadron to overcharge their hyperspace engines, creating controlled tears in reality itself. Instead of using their jump drives to travel, they were using them as bombs that literally broke the laws of physics in a small, localized area. The effect was devastating. Scourge vessels caught in the reality distortions didn't just get destroyed, they stopped existing in any meaningful sense. The twisted space-time around the overloaded jump drives created zones where matter and energy behaved according to rules that hadn't applied since the first few seconds after Big Bang. What made this even more terrifying was that the human pilots were doing this voluntarily. Amy's squadron had enough time to evacuate before their jump drives reached critical overload, but half of them chose to stay and manually guide their reality bombs to maximum effect. They weren't being ordered to make these sacrifices. They were volunteering, because it was the most efficient way to solve the tactical problem in front of them. The Scourge had spent their entire existence adapting to conventional warfare. They could evolve defenses against any weapon, develop immunity to any attack, and overcome any military strategy they encountered. What they couldn't adapt to was an enemy that refused to follow any consistent pattern. Humans weren't just fighting a war. They were treating the entire conflict like one massive improvisation exercise. Every battle was an opportunity to try something new, test a crazy theory, or see what happened when you use technology in ways it was never designed for. They came from a planet where everything was constantly trying to kill them, so they'd learned to treat every challenge as just another puzzle that could be solved with sufficient creativity and complete disregard for safety protocols. By the time the Scourge realized what they were really fighting, it was already too late to adapt. The final battle above the Cathani homeworld was unlike anything the galaxy had ever witnessed. The last Scourge hive ship was a monster beyond imagination, a biomechanical fortress the size of a small moon, covered in defensive systems that had adapted to every human tactic over the past 3 weeks of fighting. It floated there like a cancerous growth against the stars, spawning smaller vessels and consuming the debris of fallen ships to grow even larger. Commander Mike Thompson had lost 43 of his original 57 ships, but somehow the humans kept fighting. They'd thrown everything at this final enemy: conventional weapons, improvised explosives, weaponized stars, reality-tearing jump drives, and the hive ship had adapted to it all. Its hull was now a patchwork of evolved defenses, each section specifically designed to counter whatever the humans had used against it. That's when Sergeant Dan Murphy volunteered for what everyone assumed would be a one-way mission. Dan was a maintenance engineer, not a pilot or a tactical officer. He'd spent most of the war keeping the human ships running with spare parts, prayer, and what he called aggressive percussive maintenance, hitting things with bigger hammers until they worked. But he'd been watching the battle reports, and he'd noticed something that everyone else had missed. The hive ship's adaptations were reactive, not predictive. It could evolve defenses against anything it had encountered before, but it needed time to analyze new threats. Dan's solution was beautifully simple and completely terrifying. Create a threat so powerful and so immediate that the hive ship wouldn't have time to adapt. He volunteered to manually pilot a cargo ship packed with antimatter charges directly into the heart of the enemy fortress. Not using automated systems or remote guidance, those could be jammed or corrupted. He would fly the bomb himself, right up until the moment of detonation, ensuring maximum effectiveness with no chance of the Scourge interfering. What happened next became legend among both humans and the few alien species who witnessed it. Dan's modified cargo hauler, rechristened the UES Last Resort, accelerated toward the hive ship under maximum burn, while every Scourge defensive system fired everything they had at the approaching threat. The ship's hull was getting torn apart by enemy fire, atmosphere bleeding out through dozens of holes. But Dan kept flying. At the last possible second, when the cargo ship was maybe 50 meters from the hive ship's core, Dan activated the antimatter charges. The explosion that followed was visible from 3 star systems away. A brief second sun that outshone the local star and left nothing but empty space where the Scourge Fortress had been. Everyone assumed Dan Murphy had died in that explosion. It should have been physically impossible to survive being at the center of an antimatter detonation. But somehow, 3 days later, long-range sensors picked up a faint distress beacon from an escape pod drifting in the outer system. Dan had ejected at literally the last microsecond, riding the explosion shockwave away from the blast zone in an escape pod that was never designed to handle those kinds of forces. When they recovered him, Dan's first words were reportedly, "Did it work?" When told that the last hive ship was completely destroyed, he just nodded and asked for a sandwich. That was it. No heroic speeches, no dramatic declarations. Just a guy who'd solved a problem and wanted lunch. With the hive ship gone, the remaining Scourge vessels suddenly lost coordination. Without their central command node, they reverted to basic survival instincts, fleeing the system in all directions. The threat that had consumed dozens of civilizations over the past century was finally over. High Priestess Zartiate should have been celebrating. The Cathani were saved, their beautiful world was safe, and their prayers had been answered by warriors from beyond the stars. But as she stood in the ruins of her crystal city, watching the human fleet prepare for their long journey home, she found herself struggling with emotions she'd never experienced before. These humans had saved her people, but they'd also shown the galaxy something that would change everything. They hadn't just defeated an unbeatable enemy. They revealed exactly why the Galactic Council had quarantined Earth in the first place. Other species fought wars to expand territory, acquire resources, or defend their homes. Humans fought like the universe itself was personally trying to murder them. Every tactic, every strategy, every impossible solution they pulled out of nowhere came from a species that had spent millions of years treating survival as a creative art form. On Earth, everything was hostile. The weather could kill you, the animals could kill you, the plants could kill you, and even the microscopic life could kill you. Humans had evolved not just to survive in that environment, but to thrive in it. They'd learned to see every challenge as just another problem that could be solved with sufficient creativity and complete disregard for their own safety. Watching the human ships disappear one by one into hyperspace, Zartiate realized that her people had been saved by beings who were fundamentally different from every other species in the galaxy. These weren't just warriors or heroes. They were survivors from a world that had taught them that nothing was impossible if you were willing to pay the price for it. As the last human vessel vanished into the void, heading back toward their distant quarantined world, Zartiate was left with a question that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Had the Cathani been saved by angels sent from the heavens, or by demons who just happened to be on their side? And in this violent, dangerous universe where beauty and horror existed side by side, she realized that maybe there really wasn't a difference. Maybe salvation always came with sharp edges and a terrible price. Maybe the only beings capable of fighting monsters were those who had learned to be monsters themselves when necessary. The humans were gone, but the galaxy would never be the same.